This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm your co-hostess, Dalia Shendlin.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we find fascinating. And if you like arts, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us because we're counting on you.
We're very pleased today to welcome Dr. Rona Seidelman. She is Associate Professor and the Schusterman Chair of Israel Studies at the History Department at the University of Oklahoma. Professor Seidelman's research interests are in the history of immigration, the history of medicine, and public health in Israel. Could not be more timely. She's originally from Canada. She has a BA and an MA from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and a PhD from Ben Gurion University of the Negev, where she's currently a visiting scholar at the university's Center for Health, Humanism, and Society. She's speaking to us from Beersheba today, and we'll be discussing her book, Under Quarantine, Immigrants and Disease at Israel's Gate, which came out with Rutgers University Press in 2020. Rona, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
Well, we are too. Your book has a very, really, it's an unusual and fascinating theme. It centers on the practice of quarantining Israel's immigrants to prevent the spread of diseases in the formative years, in the early years of immigration following the establishment of the state. And speaking about the quarantine camp, whose name translates to Gate to Aliyah, Shaar Ha'aliya, you write the following statement: "We cannot fully understand Israel until we understand Shaar Ha'aliya." I found that to be a big statement, and I'd like to know what you mean by that.
Well, when you think about the fact that this was the central part of Israel's establishment, right, and then that's been ignored and sort of even erased in some respects. Like, this was the first place of arrival for nearly 500,000 immigrants. It's this huge piece of Israeli history, and to understand sort of what Israel became and who the Israelis were and the experiences that they had, we need to understand this huge piece of the puzzle. You need to understand, obviously, their journey and their arrival to Israel. And I think to some extent there's been a lot of research, fortunately, on the later stages, like the Ma'abarot, the transit camps, and also the Ayarot Pituach, the development towns, and this absence, not knowing enough about Shaar Ha'aliya, this first place where people stayed, where they slept, where they encountered Israeli officials, where they went through medical exams, is just something that's so important that we need to understand more fully.
But why Shaar Ha'aliya specifically? It was this camp near Haifa that operated for a few years. You're going to elaborate on this in a second. But who, what was it, in relation to Israel's immigration policy at the time? It was, in a way, the flagship of Israel's immigration.
I think one of the easiest ways to understand Shaar Ha'aliya is as Israel's Ellis Island. Right. It was the central port of immigration for the immigrants in this time, right, after the establishment of the state. It opened in 1949. It closed eventually, sort of officially, in 1962, but that was after petering out over many years. And its most significant years were, and its busiest years were up until 1950 and then 1952 to some extent. 1950 was sort of its busiest year. But this like how, imagine trying to understand America without understanding Ellis Island. Imagine having that absence. That's just something that's really so central to understanding people's experiences. And also when you think about the encounters in the camp, how those shaped people and in some ways traumatized people. Not everyone, of course. I think that is just a really important piece of the puzzle of understanding what this country became and how people were shaped by this country and their experiences when they arrived.
Let's get into the details. What were they quarantined for?
I mean, when you think about sort of the plan or the idea of isolating immigrants at Shaar Ha'aliya. It was that they would stay there for a few days while going through medical exams and testing for some infectious diseases. The major diseases that were tracked at Shaar Ha'aliya were tuberculosis, trachoma, and ringworm. Those were some of the main disease that they were looking for. There were also blood tests done to test for syphilis. So those were some of the main things that the diseases that they were tracked in Shaar Ha'aliya, and that they went through these medical exams, which were very challenging for the immigrants who were going through them. That whole experience of going through the exam after arriving, being newly arrived there. And then the whole context of the camp, which was very crowded and difficult, and became very crowded and difficult very quickly after its establishment in 1949.
How long did they stay on average? And based on what criteria?
So it was intended that people would stay for just a few days, right? The idea was that, and this sort of thing, you can think back to Ellis Island in many respects. The idea was that they would stay for just a few days and go through the medical exam. People would arrive and then find a place to stay in the camp, and then they were supposed to stay until the exam, and then leave from there and then go to their permanent places of residence in Israel. But the way that I describe it is that this plan really quickly fell through, and that it became impossible to get people out in time before the new sort of ship and flights of people arrived in the camp. And so you had this huge backlog, people not knowing when to arrive at their medical exams at the time that they were supposed to, and ending up staying in the camp, they were intended to stay there for just a few days, but ending up staying there for weeks and even months, for various different reasons, right? For why they ended up staying there for weeks and months. So you don't have just one experience. Some people did manage to get out in a few days, but other people were there for a very, very long time.
But it sounds like that in itself, if some of them came presumably with some infectious diseases, that the camp itself could be a breeding ground for disease. And I guess what I'm curious about is, A, is that true? But also, was this Ellis Island in the sense of everybody going through it? Or was there some, preferential treatment for certain immigrants over others that played into Israel's existing divisions?
There were people who didn't go through Shaar Ha'aliya in those first years, but largely those are the exceptions and not the rule. A lot of the time when people do know or have any sort of understanding what Shaar Ha'aliya was, let's say I'll be talking to people, or when I'm doing my research, saying that I was doing research on Shaar Ha'aliya, it was this this misconception that it was primarily for Mizrahim, right? For Jewish immigrants from North African and Arab and Muslim countries. And that's sort of the way that it's retained in some respects, sort of as remembering it as a sore point, right? As though it was only Mizrahim who were held in Shaar Ha'aliya behind this barbed wire fence. And that isn't true. It was intended for all of the immigrants who came through in those years. And you do have Mizrahim and Ashkenazim. The largest waves of immigrants to go through Shaar Ha'aliya were in 1950, and that was from Iraq and from Romania. So you have sort of that spectrum. But then the practical aspect of it was also that if you had people who were already working in the camp or familiar with people, those connections, you could get out quicker, right? Just generally those connections, and that is something that sort of would tend to work in favor of people who already had families settled in Israel and who were better connected. So those are some of the sort of the idea of it was for everybody, and that so many different people from different backgrounds did come through the camp. But then the practical aspect of it is if you speak the same language as the people who are working there and can figure out the system better, then you have a better way sort of dealing with that situation.
How did the existence of a camp surrounded by barbed wire go down in the public discourse at the time, so few years after Jews were held in well, a similar setting, albeit in very different circumstances. But it echoed certain feelings.
Yeah, so that was, as you see in the photographs also in my book, right? This was a real problem, and that's what the sort of the discussion of quarantine at Shaar Ha'aliya revolved around. That there was this barbed wire fence, this camp, right? This sort of Ellis Island, right? They didn't call it that, but or as far as I could see in the documents, right? But that's one way to think about this central gate of immigration, this place that's supposed to be of welcoming and homecoming for Jews so soon after the establishment of the state and so soon after the end of the Holocaust. It was surrounded by an intimidating and ugly and threatening barbed wire fence. Right. And this was something that was widely criticized at the time, right? And from all, you have journalists writing about this. You have international journalists, local journalists. You have members of Knesset. You have immigrants. You have other people in the public, just really across the board, people saying this is absolutely terrible. We should not have Jewish immigrants arriving to the new Jewish state. They should not be held behind barbed wire. And these ideas of saying that this looks like the term, the way they often described it was like, this looks like the camps of Europe that we know so well, right? So this was something that was widely criticized. And then this is where the point about quarantine comes in a way that's so interesting. So then sort of the way that it was then defended, this barbed wire fence, which was so problematic, right? As the sort of the camp authority and administration saying, you are right, this looks terrible, and it's so unfortunate, but it's necessary from a public health standpoint because the immigrants that are coming in are carrying dangerous diseases, and this is a quarantine, and it's normative and unfortunate, but it's necessary. So that's where it becomes really sort of interesting or starts to become interesting. The next point that sort of complicates this, and that I discuss so much in my book, is the fact that the same people who are then defending it, right, and saying this is necessary because this is the way that we're keeping them isolated with their diseases that could threaten the Yishuv, that could threaten sort of the larger population. The same people that were defending it knew that there were holes in the fence and that immigrants in the camp were largely coming and going through these holes in the fence. Right? And this wasn't a one-time thing. This was something that was commonly done and understood, to the point that you have a camp official who said, in theory, the camp is closed, but in reality, it's open to all. So at the same time, they're saying we need to keep them isolated and we need this unfortunate, ugly, intimidating barbed wire fence. But at the same time, they knew that it wasn't so effective. Right? It wasn't preventing immigrants, and in that way, it wasn't a hermetic quarantine, and people, were in contact with one another and in effect, potentially spreading those diseases.
So the epidemiological justification for its existence was secondary? Was it primarily, means of population management?
The way that I've come to understand it is that the people who are sort of using this defense and turning to the quarantine and the public health defense are the same people who are feeling very threatened by this massive wave of immigration, right? And there is the aspect of health that's involved. But whenever we talk about the history of quarantine, you have to think about the biological aspects, but then there's also the social aspects that come into play. And I see this as being sort of a defense, a sort of this idea of suggested control in a time that felt very out of control for the people who were working in Shaar Ha'aliya, for the administration, and then for the Yishuv also, that was feeling very threatened by this the changes and the potential diseases, but also social changes that were coming with this very, very large wave of immigration.
And how does that play into the value system? I mean, there are two angles that jumped out at me. One is that I think maybe by the end, at certain points, you refer to the possibility that this was not only a protective measure, but that it was in some way punitive. And perhaps to avoid that accusation, the government policy at points tried to deny that it was actually a quarantine camp. How did these values surrounding the idea of quarantine actually play out?
Well, I think that one of the points that I think that ties into this that I've thought about a lot, that I actually don't write about in the book because it's something that came to me later, right? And maybe also through my own experiences. I mean, this book came out a few weeks, came out officially at the end of December 2019.
You could not have had better timing.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about that too.
Right.
Yeah.
But that I wondered how different the story would have been if it hadn't been a barbed wire fence. What if they had just taken down the barbed wire, right? And if there had been a fence and sort of understanding maybe that it makes sort of logical sense to have a space that's enclosed, right? Or surrounded by, framed, let's say, by a fence. But if it hadn't been barbed wire, if they had taken down the barbed wire, and why they didn't do that, right, is something that I think is very important to ask. And one of the things that I saw, that I found in the archives was that, this camp this space had originally been a British military camp. I don't know if it was St. Luke's or St. Lucas. Seen it differently in different documents. So this was originally a British military camp that was then renovated and turned into Shaar Ha'aliya, right? And when the space was renovated, you have the documents in the archives, there were internal barbed wire fences. They built, they built more cabins and they renovated the whole premises to make it sort of something that was more fitted to an immigration camp or an immigration processing camp. But one of the things that they did was they took down internal barbed wire fences that had been in the camp, but they left the external barbed wire fences. And I just wonder how this would have been different if it hadn't been barbed wire.
Okay, but that's appearances. I mean, in what sense was it punitive, if you think that description holds up? Or do you think that was somehow injected later by traumatic historical memory?
You mean punitive in terms of them having to be at the camp at all?
Well, or in terms of their own experiences, did they perceive it as being punitive? I mean, or maybe we should really go into the people who suffered, who are those who encountered some of the really vicious treatments for some of their diseases, because that's also part of your book.
Right. I would say that there's no one experience of Shaar Ha'aliya, right? Especially when we're talking about over or nearly 500,000 people. And just, reading through oral history and reading through the documents, you have people who went through Shaar Ha'aliya and it was sort of a blip on their whole immigration experience, and even oral histories and interviews with people who were older and Mizrahim and from backgrounds that, that maybe you would have expected, to have found it more traumatic. And it was a blip on their immigration experience. You have other people for whom it was fun, right? They were young, and I remember interviewing one man from Iraq, and he was, I think, around 17 or so, and he came and he arrived with friends, and they knew some Hebrew, so they managed to get along, and he recalled laying out in the sunshine, right? And I might be confusing the laying out in the sunshine with another image of immigrants who have arrived and laying out in the sunshine on their beds. They're younger, right, in their 20s or so, right? But there are people for whom it was a fun adventure, right? But you do also have then people for whom it was very traumatic, and that depends on, what their experiences were. There were cases of theft. There was crime in Shaar Ha'aliya, right? It was a very crowded camp where people, from all walks of life and living in close quarters. You could be sleeping in a tent with people who are strangers and potentially threatening. I know that there were cases of prostitution in Shaar Ha'aliya, right? There were things that were very challenging, and there were people, if they encountered, some crime in Shaar Ha'aliya, that would have been very traumatic. And then in addition to that was the traumatic sort of medical experiences that you're talking about. There's also people, family members who were sick, parents who had babies and children that were sick in Shaar Ha'aliya, and that was hugely traumatic. And then if you had the treatment of ringworm and children who were treated for ringworm in a separate part of the camp, which is part of Shaar Ha'aliya, the Center for the Treatment of Ringworm and Trachoma in Immigrant Children. And the treatment for ringworm has remained as a trauma within Israeli society up until today, but it was traumatic also at that time for so many reasons. So there just isn't one experience at Shaar Ha'aliya. There are so many different experiences, and it's hard to gauge how any one person would have experienced it. And it's very much sort of a personal a factor that just depends on so many different factors of language and age, right? If they were a child and were protected by their parents, or if they were parents caring for children, if, how long they ended up staying, if they were sick, etc., which determined how they experienced the camp.
But a broader determining factor is the fact that perhaps Aliyah is not synonymous with immigration. I mean, the act of Aliyah, both for the establishment and the migrants themselves, has this, aura of something, especially in these years, so soon after the establishment of the State of Israel, Chalom Hadorot, right, the dream of the generations. How did that affect, everything that you've just been describing now?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because one of the issues that I thought about a lot in my dissertation, I used the word aliyah, right? Even though it was written in English, I always wrote the word aliyah, and I didn't do that in the book. I wrote them as like immigrants rather than olim, and I used the word immigration as opposed to aliyah, which was sort of an interesting sort of thought process that I had. But in terms of the immigrants coming in, and the idea of aliyah made it even more sort of, it's more than disappointing, but disappointing sort of to start with, right? But more than that people who are coming to Israel and seeing it as like this was, for so many people, this idea of the promised land, right? Both in terms of that larger ideal, then on a practical level after the war, like this was finally like the establishment of a Jewish state. This was going to be a place of homecoming. This was going to be their homeland. And having so many, this is such an idealized and romanticized location. And then coming there and arriving, and then the first thing to greet you is this barbed wire fence. This was so hugely demoralizing for so many people. So I think that the fact that the expectations were lifted with Aliyah, as you say, made it even harder to accept that this was how they were, their first point of arrival in the Jewish state was going to be. Looked like this and was this.
Maybe this is just me with my gruesome fascination, but I was really struck by the
Probably
chapter
is, yeah.
with some of the children who had gone through the ringworm treatment, talking about how it traumatized them so many years later. And I guess, first of all, I am curious to hear from you, because you really researched this up close, why it was so traumatic. And is there anything particularly Israeli about this, or was this simply the normal medical practice in Western medicine at the time?
So it's a great question. The ringworm treatment is a very heartbreaking story, right? That is very much about sort of the problems with biomedicine, just generally. And then there are the Israeli elements to the story when we think about it in the context of Shaar Ha'aliya and the mass immigration right after the establishment of the state. So ringworm treatment, ringworm is a fungal infection. That's a mild fungal infection. Like it doesn't, it's even sort of in the 1950s, it was known that ringworm does not lead to anything dangerous, right? It isn't like tuberculosis that could kill you, or trachoma, which could lead to blindness. I think in the 19th century, ringworm was classified or categorized in American immigration as a loathsome contagious disease, right? So not a dangerous contagious disease, but because it was seen as so ugly, throughout the world and throughout centuries, it's been categorized as a loathsome contagious disease, and it qualified people for it. It made for in terms of immigration to America and other countries. If somebody had ringworm, they could be denied. They could be denied entry and immigration, right, because of having ringworm. And so you have the situation that in Israel, they opened up a camp in Shaar Ha'aliya to treat children with ringworm and trachoma in Shaar Ha'aliya right after they arrived in the country. But sort of the layers of trauma, one of the ways that I describe it is that with ringworm and the ringworm treatment, there were layers of trauma because there was the fact that, they had this disease that was considered loathsome. It was sort of this, you just create these sort of rings of sort of greasy looking skin on the head, right? So it's very visible. So you have that. And then the way that it was treated was that the children arriving at Shaar Ha'aliya were then separated from their family and put in this camp, this separate part of the camp, and this treatment center where they stayed for usually around 2 months to be treated for ringworm. So you have that trauma already, right, of children who've just arrived and are then separated from their families immediately. And then their parents largely left the camps and they would, and be sent to Ayarot Pituach or to Ma'abarot or wherever they were living.
Development towns and transit camps.
Yeah, and then not have access to their children right after moving there, and how traumatic that is for the families and how traumatic that is for the children, right? That separation, which is just heartbreaking. But then you have another layer of trauma, which was for the treatment of ringworm at that time was incredibly harsh within Western medicine. And it was, first of all, the children's heads would be shaved. So you have children like, 10 years old, 8 years old, 7 years old who all of a sudden are bald, which was very mortifying for so many people, right? This mortifying sort of stigma of being bald. But then on top of that, the next layer, sort of another additional layer of trauma, was that the treatment they would have any hairs waxed, right? Which is incredibly painful, right? To completely have the head waxed. And then the next stage of trauma, which develops sort of into a trauma in later years, was that the other stage of treatment was treating it with radiation. And then what you have in later years is that so many of the children who were treated for ringworm developed deadly, lethal cancers in later stages of their lives. So there are so many layers of trauma with the ringworm treatment. And so but this was the normative accepted Western medicine at the time, and treatment, and sort of in many ways was seen by the people who were doing it and initiating this treatment as being an act of tremendous benevolence, right? That this is really the sort of the height of technological sort of possibilities and treatment that's being given for free to these children who would otherwise go without and would otherwise be marked by this loathsome, stigma of having ringworm. And so that aspect of it is sort of very international. But then the specifics of how it was happening with the children being separated and treated in this camp, I see as being particular to this story.
Does this in any way correlate with the attitudes of the much more infamous case of spraying DDT on people coming from the Middle East and North African countries, which really has been seared into the symbolic memory of the country?
Yeah, I think it's definitely connected, right? It's definitely connected as one of these major traumas from the immigration.
I meant in terms of like a medical practice that was considered in good faith at the time, which we now look upon with repulsion.
Yes, I see them as being very similar. Part of the similarity also, though, is the way that they're remembered is primarily being Mizrahim. And one of the things that I find, I don't know, I actually should, if there have been more recent studies looking specifically at the DDT treatment, but one of the things that I found to be very interesting when I was doing research on this, that the DDT was not specifically Mizrahim, right? It was also immigrants from European countries who were sprayed with DDT when they arrived in Israel. some of what I found, and this is something that I'd be interested in hearing sort of more research. These are sort of more anecdotal things that I found in the archives that I didn't look into in great detail. But I remember coming across some interviews and oral histories where Holocaust survivors, they saw DDT as something welcoming, right? After being in the DP camps, this was after being, the problem with scabies and body lice as being so dangerous and so horrible that DDT was something that was understood and sort of welcomed by many people. And the difference is sort of then not sort of having that frame of reference. That is somewhat anecdotal, right? Those are from some interviews that I read. But that I think is really interesting to think about further. But definitely, like with the DDT and the ringworm as being medical practices that, as you say, sort of we look upon today as being just so painful, right? And how, the questioning how this could have been the choice, right? And the medical recommendations, but that at the time were done so broadly and looked upon as being really so, again, an act of sort of medical and benevolence.
What's remained of Shaar Ha'aliya, both physically and conceptually in the collective memory? You spend some time in the book discussing it, comparing it to the athlete camp that is just a couple of miles south of Shaar Ha'aliya and was used by the British, a mere several months or years before as the immigration camp into Palestine, and it remained much more present in the collective memory of Israelis as opposed to Shaar Ha'aliya. What can you tell us about that?
So the site of Shaar Ha'aliya, if you go into Haifa today, right, if you were to drive in like from the coast, right at the entrance to the city, there are signs, right? There's a neighborhood known as Shaar Ha'aliya. So this is a neighborhood in Haifa. Aside from the name, there is nothing. There is no historical marker. I should probably add that the last time I was there was 2 years ago. I would go every couple of years to check to see. But when I was there 2 years ago, there was still nothing. Throughout my PhD, there isn't even a sign sort of explaining to people like me, looking for something, what this was, let alone anything bigger, right? Let alone a museum or a heritage site. There's nothing. And I find that to be particularly interesting in comparison, as you say, with Atlit, which is around a 15-minute drive away from Shaar Ha'aliya. And this British detention camp, right, where Jews were held behind barbed wire, right, but by the British, is a famous, right, heritage site and a huge and incredibly impressive heritage site with it. It's not just a museum, it's this entire site that is, an archive and not a reenactment, but they've built huts, sort of imagining sort of what this place would have looked like with people living in it. And you have nothing like that in Shaar Ha'aliya, which was so much bigger and that was so important to Israel, right? And I find that absence to be very, very striking. And one of the things that I say in the book and that I thought about a lot is that if you were to build a heritage site or a museum in Shaar Ha'aliya for it to look to be sort of historically accurate, it would look a lot like what they've built in Atlit. Except the difference is in Atlit, one of the things that is so central to the memorialization there is that it was so wrong for the British to put Jews behind barbed wire. It's so central to if you read the catalog, if you look at the signs when you're going through, it's just so much a part of the way that Atlit is memorialized, is that it was wrong for the British to be putting Jews behind barbed wire here in the land of Israel. And if you were to make a museum or a heritage site in Shaar Ha'aliya that was historically accurate, it would look so much like the heritage site of Atlit, and so many of those remembrances would be the same. And it's so much easier, right, when it's saying like the British shouldn't have done this to Jews, to sort of coming to terms with saying like this is what happened in Israel. That's a much harder history to confront.
So that's my follow-up question then is, should Jews be doing this to other people? And the reason I ask that is because your book really touches on some very contemporary themes, one of which, of course, is the waves of migrants and asylum seekers who have come in through Africa, usually going through horrors as they cross the Sinai Desert, smuggling themselves in. And the Israeli authorities have blocked them, but part of the claims of those who opposed their presence was always, well, they bring horrible diseases. Are there any parallels, and have you thought about the insights that we can gain from that?
Yeah, there are definite parallels, and I think that we need to see these parallels and understand how they're playing out now. I remember when I was doing my PhD, this is sort of a story that was seared in my memory, that being in a taxi, when I was early on in my PhD, thinking that, in terms of everybody needed to know this story. Being in a taxi where the driver was telling me, these immigrants who are coming in, or they're not cultured and they're bringing diseases. And I thought that the most evocative way to sort of bring this to his attention, for him to understand, it was clear to me that he was from Moroccan origin. Right? Jewish Moroccan. And I said to him, you need to understand that the things that you're saying now about the people who are coming in were the same things that people were saying about your mother, right? That people were saying about your parents. And he made it very clear to me that I should not speak about his mother that way, right? Not my mother. Nobody said anything.
I was wondering about
my
that.
Mother
Yeah, that was pretty brave of you, yeah.
Right, or pretty stupid of me, right? But the fact that, what I've seen as being the defense that then people would then say today is yes, but they're not Jewish, right? They're not Jewish, so it's different. And I don't see it as being different, right? I see it as being the way, because at the time it was saying yes, but they're not Ashkenazim, or they're Holocaust survivors, and it's the various ways that we see the people as being others, and that we need to then keep them out. And that we using sort of disease as an excuse to exclude people is something that is very, very problematic. And I, what I would always hope that, and I think that you see in this story, is the need to be more empathetic, and for us to be more welcoming, right? And to question those barriers that we put in place in the various stages.
Isn't it just incredibly curious that your book came out just a few weeks before everyone, quarantine became a buzzword? And
not just a buzzword, a buzz reality.
A buzz reality, yeah. But everyone, it was probably the most searched word on Google, whatever. And I'd like to ask you whether you think that, your work on quarantining, etc., gave you some sort of insight into understanding the reality of, the current pandemic that we're struggling with.
Yes, it was very strange. It was very strange for me. And it had, I think on a personal level, it was both very helpful, sort of in terms of understanding what was going on. This was just on a sort of a very micro kind of level, but it was also very disturbing, right? Seeing things that, that I feel could have been prevented, and, playing out on a public level and right across the world, and so many upsetting themes, whether it's, the scapegoating of vulnerable communities, blaming them for contagion, various governments using the fear of contagion as a way to further authoritarian agendas, right? And using also the fear of contagion to as a way to justify xenophobic closures and border closures. That was incredibly disheartening. But I think that for me also sort of, you find comfort where you can. And I think that I saw, I was teaching my course on the history of disease at the time that the pandemic, when we went online, and the university took comfort in my students sort of learning about these histories and applying them and seeing them around them. It's reinforced for me, which is something that I've always sort of felt, but the need for collaboration between policymakers, healthcare workers, and humanists, right? Historians of medicine, anthropologists of medicine who really have something valuable to bring to the table. And I think that when we see this, I'm heartened when I see this happening, and that's very useful. I think that, two of them, when I sort of think about the two main points that I think that I would want people to come away with, or that I sort of also clung to with the history of quarantine and in this time. And one was that when it is implemented carefully, right, quarantine can work. This is a global, ancient act of, sort of very human self-preservation, and that when it's done appropriately, it can work. But then the other point that I think is so important is that in times of upheaval, right, in uncertain historical times, very much like the one that we're living through now, we need to watch out to make sure that the most vulnerable members of our communities and marginalized peoples are not being unfairly targeted and excluded. And those, I think, are the two main points that, that I just keep coming back to in the midst of this period, while, having this research very central in my mind.
Dr. Rona Seidelman, I think you should be on the government advisory committees for corona policy from now on. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. I appreciate it.
And thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios, and to our producer, Ariel Cohen, and to Ro'i Shelem for helping to produce today's episode. Now, a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcast app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. We like to hear all sides of an argument, so please write anything you like. You too can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. We have over 700 interviews, Gilad?
Probably, yeah, more or less, yeah.
Like us on Facebook and Twitter. Follow me and Gilad on Twitter individually and the Tel Aviv Review podcast. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.